So it's not just a headline that angers you or a headline that, that makes you feel emotional, but you actually understand it. Even if you don't agree with it, it's totally fine.
Who does the responsibility fall on? Does it fall on consumers to be looking at their sources, or does it fall on journalists to make sure that they're objective?
A leader in the conversation of changing journalism. So I'd like to welcome Dennis Swibold. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 2. Thank you so much for being here. We're very excited to keep this going. I'm Dalen Turk.
I'm Kara Tebow.
I'm Curtis Medina.
Man, Curtis, you're just...
Is that really
like,
you?
gosh, dang, you're just not on it. I need some urgency. All right, guys, welcome to episode 2. Thanks for listening in. So as we discussed last episode, that was a little bit more of placing context and a little bit more of a historical, I guess, picture of what media is and what it was and kind of the way it's transformed and changed from, as we said, if you listened, from the press literally to the media. But today we're hoping to go into looking a little bit more of how we perceive it, how we can communicate it, and really answering some questions of how we can be more news literate.
Well, one thing that really excited me about doing this podcast is to tell, the perspective of sort of, millennials and younger generations. We're kind of shut out of a lot of, a lot of news right now, either because we don't connect with it or we don't subscribe to it, or, maybe we don't even see it. And one thing I just realized was, there's so much that has changed in the way that news is reported and how we take it in, just in our lifetimes. Like, I've only been an adult for like 15 years, and and so I feel like a pretty young person still, and still I think back 15 years ago, and there's so many things that just didn't exist or just didn't work the way it does now. So it hasn't really been something that has been that long ago changed. So for example, just the rise of the internet, getting us through that. This idea of like 24-hour cable networks is fairly new. Opinions being kind of mixed back and forth with news and having those lines blurred and all that. So really what I want to get out of the podcast today is to figure out what the heck has happened to Americans' perception of the press, and how do we fix that? I feel like it's something that we have to do as millennials, because there's this huge gap between baby boomers who are pretty much in most of the high position power right now. They're this huge generation, and you have the Gen X in between, but they're sort of there, but I never totally feel their presence on a lot of these things. And then there's millennials, and we're kind of the oldest generation that's going to remember how some of these things were, some of the things that worked that maybe we're not doing as much anymore.
And I think we touched on it at the end of the last episode, your idea of, how we perceive the press, how we perceive the media. And I was talking about, a woman who, she shared this video, and it was, I'm a nurse and I have a friend who's a nurse in New York, but I'm not going to say her name. And she works at this hospital, but I'm not going to say the name of the hospital. And it was just a video on YouTube. And it seems like people struggle to differentiate that content from the news. And I think a key word for that is content, because I think content is different from news, but to some people it's all the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we have to understand, what news is pushing an opinion, even if it is through the news, or what news is actually giving us, a balanced view of both sides. For example, there was a story recently, and I wanted to, okay, so let me back up a little bit. So a few months ago, I had a conservative friend of mine, huge Trump supporter, tell me about this thing called One America News Network. Now, it's been getting a lot of press lately. It was covered in Last Week Tonight. Trump tweets about it constantly. It's basically supposed to be like the Fox News that conservatives want it to be. Like it's even more to the right.
A quick point.
And so I kept,
you mentioned like John Oliver and whatnot. I find it interesting because a lot of the ways that these kind of underground right-leaning quote-unquote news sources get some of their light is through a lot of these left-leaning satirical shows that make jokes about them.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, he literally spent the whole episode talking about it. But to his credit, though, like, he did wait until it actually, was pretty big. Of course, it's going to make it bigger just by talking about it, and I'm scared that even us talking about it is somehow going to turn more people onto it. But which is not really my point in doing that. But at the same time, if the president's tweeting it constantly, it's already there.
Yes.
So in a way to ignore it, is really not a great idea. And I think it's a better idea to understand why this news network is connecting with a demographic of people who no longer connect with, quote unquote mainstream media.
Yeah.
So one of the things I did was I took a story. I just wanted to see sort of how it would, compare. I took a story on One American Network, and I found that same story on, let's see, did I do that right? I found that same story on the LA Times. It was kind of a basic, boring story. It was about a district in California which might flip for the first time from Democrat back to Republican. It'd be the first time it did it in like 20 years. And there's a bunch of circumstances around it about how like there's a bit of a scandal about the person that left office, and it's already kind of conservative, and Trump's been tweeting about it and all this stuff. So it's like kind of a nothing story, except for the fact that people keep kind of like trying to look at it as a litmus test for how the rest of the country is thinking. So anyway, so I looked at the One American Network coverage of it, and one of the things I've been noticing about stories on that website is that a lot of them are really short. Like they're just like, it's almost like the ticker tape machine that used to go on, you used to see on Fox News or CNN or whatever. It would just have like a quick blurb and just enough to sort of get you interested, but it wouldn't have to follow up with a lot of details. So like on One American Network, the headline was Republican officials was California special congressional election with Mike Garcia. Hold on a second. Let me back up. I need to actually have this up. I'm looking at the link, but not actually looking at it.
No, that's actually really interesting. Like you discussed the length of these articles, and it definitely seems like some of these kind of more underground, not mainstream media news sources gain a lot of their traction off the fact that they're not producing this really long forms of content because it's easier for people to consume.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's sort of stories that tell you what you want to hear, and that's great if that's your only objective. But if you actually want to understand what's going on in the world and like why things are happening, it's just really not all that helpful.
Well, and you could argue that maybe they don't want them to fully understand what's going on.
Well, that's the problem, is that news wasn't meant to be consumed in a headline. That's not what news originally was. You had your 3 W's, who, what, where, when, why, how, plus your age, obviously. And print media, or print journalism, was originally intended to just flush out those basic details, but you had to read the article. It wasn't meant to tell a story through the title. And now, as we evolved through social media, we just scroll and people literally get their news that way. I think I read a stat the other day from Pew Poll. They said like 72% of readers believe that the information they're getting from their friends' social media posts is reliable. as reliable as traditional news organizations.
Because why would your friends lie to you, right?
Right. Right.
So it's because they don't know themselves.
They don't. And so now we're literally gathering our news by scrolling through headlines, and you have to have the juiciest headline. And if it sounds fun, why not believe it? Who cares about facts?
So this is the headline. This is the headline in One American Network. It says Republican officials call foul play in California special election. The same headline in Los Angeles Times is, during the pandemic, Republicans see a rare political opportunity in California. So like, yeah, a little different, same story. And so, of course, headline's going to be whatever the source is going to sort of like appeal more to, whomever. I say they're both guilty of that. But when you actually look at the story, the one on One American Network, that story literally fits in to like a fourth of what the Los Angeles Times did. Like Los Angeles Times doesn't like quote One American Network, but basically they have their story almost verbatim inside of their story, except the Los Angeles Times goes the extra step and shows the other side, and they actually quotes officials or whatever.
I do wonder, like, what the staff size of companies like One American News Network and the Epoch Times and, whatever other, like, I'm trying to think of other.
I imagine they're quite small because they're such niche.
Yeah, or even
news
like
industries.
What is it? Patriobotics or whatever it is, or Occupy Democrats or
Patriobotics. That sounds like a bad sci-fi
So
movie.
I'm looking at the media bias map, and it shows like all this like different. Yeah. And so at the most radical on each end, for left leaning, the most radical is the Patriobotics, and for right leaning, the most radical is InfoWars, which we're not surprised there.
Right. Well, I mean, I think a lot of people expect biases, and like when you turn on Fox News, you expect it to be sort of the Republican viewpoint. And so that to me doesn't matter so much, but you have to also balance it out with more a headline that angers you, or a headline that, that makes you feel emotional, but you actually understand it. Even if you don't agree with it, it's totally fine. Like when I posted a link the other day to Facebook, my conservative friend, the same one that shared the One American Network thing, he looked at the New York Times thing I posted, and he was like, "Oh, we should just believe them." And like a thing I pointed out last week, no, you shouldn't just believe them, but they do have like considerable more resources and more to lose. So like what you just said, Dalen, about like, what are the staffs? There's probably no comparison. Los Angeles Times is a huge operation. I'm sure One American Network is a fraction thereof, and it shows in their reporting.
Then you wonder too, like what kind of recruiting they're doing. Like who are they attracting to work for them?
People with an agenda, you'd imagine, and that's the problem.
See, and it makes you wonder if you get these students coming out of college, they've got their journalism degree, or even if you go into the journalism field without proper journalism training, are you going in with a specific bias to go to a news source or a media source that leans toward that? Is that something you're aiming for? Or do you, like, I guess maybe I'm naive in thinking that the vast majority, if not all of, journalists come out of journalism school being like, I'm going to be objective. I'm going to be the true journalist. Or do people come out of journalism school being like, okay, I have the training, now I want to use that to push, my side of things?
I bet there's a fair few mix, but there's also those small organizations that when you're starting out as a new journalist, you also just take what you can get, right?
It's true.
Like you find yourself we've all taken, most of us have taken internships or first jobs, and we're like, ooh, this doesn't really align with me, but it's my stepping stone. It's my path. So I don't know if it's, I got to make a paycheck and I know that this is what I'm supposed to write, or do you get, indoctrinated along the way, or who knows? I bet there's a good mix of the two.
Well, and it's like, even I was working at Talk 1370. It's Talk 1370, the right choice. And that doesn't necessarily.
Honey, you have to give it to them.
I mean, it's great. Like, let's be real here. That's pretty solid.
that is a brilliant slogan.
Like,
Trademark that.
It's wonderful. And everyone I worked there, everybody was, had their own political views. Not everyone was right leaning, and it was great. It was a wonderful newsroom to work in. And I'll say too, because it doesn't necessarily line up with my personal views. One sec, folks. We'll be right back. We have a guest coming on here in a minute. All right, everybody. Thank you. We are right back. We have me, Dalen, Kara, and Curtis here, and we have a special guest. He's been a professor at the University of Montana Journalism School since 1989. He was a reporter in Arizona and Montana. He was the editor for the Bozeman Daily Chronicle. He served on the board for the Montana Innocence Project and the Montana Newspaper Association. And in my opinion, he is a leader in the conversation of changing journalism. So I'd like to welcome Dennis Swibold.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you for being here. So we've been talking for the past 15 minutes or so kind of about how journalism's been changing and how we as consumers and journalists can responsibly handle that. So I think a first question I want to ask you as a professor is, and actually we were just talking about it, is students coming out of journalism school, if they have this idea of being, the pure objective journalist, like I know me and my classmates had, what changes have you seen with journalism students coming into school and leaving in terms of the way media has changed and how they can create news nowadays?
Well, I think they're pretty earnest, and the students really haven't changed all that much in terms of what they want to do. How they can do that has changed, obviously.
Very much so.
And the economic environment to make that happen and to make it robust has changed a lot too. But I do think they care. They want people to be well informed. They want to be a part of that activity. But they also want to make sure that they're telling true stories. And I think that's something that they care about even more. I had a lot of discussion in this semester's ethics and trend class about what they call advocacy journalism, and we had probably had the same discussion in your section years ago. We were talking about what it means to be objective, and I think there's kind of an obsolete idea of that. I don't think a lot of people really know what objectivity means in any kind of science sense. And what it means is you ask a question and then go out looking for all the best evidence and see what your answer is. They see problems, and they see problems that they want to help solve. And they think that that's a mission that journalism should have. And I actually think good journalism can come from both motivations. It's not an either or thing. It all depends on how you do it. So we spend a lot of time talking about credibility. And if you're an advocacy journalist, I guess, and if you've got a cause that you want to support, who are you going to be talking to? Are you just going to be preaching to the choir? You really think you're going to be very credible if you dismiss salient evidence on another side of an issue? All of those things get discussion hashed out pretty well in class. And I think they understand that even if they want to be, some of my favorite journalists were investigators. Some of my favorite journalists saw problems and wanted to tell people about them. And I admire that, that outrage that fuels a lot of the best journalism and investigation that the world, has ever seen. But the key question for me is, how are you going to do that in a way that's persuasive? How are you going to do that in a way that makes people believe you and take you seriously? And if they're not doing that, then what are you accomplishing? So that's the way I put the question. And they come back to it every single time. I mean, I'm not surprised by it, but it does seem to be as journalism and politics seems to them more polarized as they see examples of false equivalencies being described as objective. As they see all those kind of things, they wonder what the real answer is, and they wonder if they can really get at problems. And I think they can. They just have to learn how to be really good reporters to do that. And they have to learn, the basics of, critical thinking and good ethical understanding of what's going on, and that's a part of what I think is more important than ever, is just this sort of critical thinking that humans are not naturally very good at, frankly.
No, we're not.
It's not in our DNA, and we have to sort of be taught how to do that, taught how to think it through. And this media environment doesn't make it any easier to have a thoughtful response to things that happen so quickly when people are demanding instant answers. How do you ask questions like, who's behind the information? What's the evidence? What do other sources say? Those are the kind of hallmarks of a critical thinking approach, and I think there's not a whole lot of patience for that from an audience. In some respects, it has all these other sources at their disposal. You can find a website for everything.
Well, it's so interesting.
Budget either.
Like, so many people are willing to shrug off individual reporters plainly because they're associated with CNN or Fox News or whatever it may be. They're more identified with whatever the perspective is rather than the news that they're actually producing. Yeah,
there's no question that that's part of what's going on too. I mean, I think you see trust in the media become more polarized. It's always been polarized to some extent. I mean, you can go back to the 70s and look at some Gallup polls on trust in the media, and you'll find a big split between how much Democrats and Republicans trust the media. That's fallen now, and I think part of that is just due to the fact that you can find a lot of information to support exactly what you want to do. There's a way of getting information that starts with a theory, that starts with a prejudice even, and then cherry picks facts. And if that's the way you want to think, then you're going to find just about anything you want to find when you're out there trying to look for evidence. So I think that's a problem that journalists have to confront today. And people are polarized too. They suddenly have these news sources at their disposal. So their news sources aren't as scarce as they used to be. The question is whether they're as authoritative as they used to be, but they're certainly not scarce, and you can find them in just a lot of places too. So I think that's one of the problems that you're going to have to have. I'm kind of optimistic that with time and some media literacy, we're gonna get over the hump in some regard here. I don't think you'll ever stamp out a misinformation or disinformation. It's so embedded in our DNA for so many, good cognitive brain reasons. People who research this stuff know that we're hardwired to accept some of this stuff. Sometimes we don't have much click restraint, right?
Absolutely not.
And we talked
so
about
I
this.
think it's hard. It's really hard to get people to slow down and think this thing through.
Go ahead, Kara.
We talked about this a lot last week of just, sorry, Curtis, of just this confirmation bias and these echo chambers and this me media.
Right.
And, like you said, it's never been easier to confirm the position that you would like to, view the world as. And then it's almost this identity crisis. And of course it's fake news. If you hear something that you don't like that goes against, your beliefs, or that's a little bit anxiety provoking, because just shut that off and go subscribe to what's going to make you feel good. And so I think that's such a prevalent issue in our society with media right now. And I'm just curious, who does the responsibility fall on? Does it fall on consumers to be looking at their sources, or does it fall on journalists to make sure that they're objective?
Well, the real answer that's not very satisfying is that it falls on everybody. It really does. Everyone has to sort of understand this environment and learn how to swim in it a little bit better. I don't think any of these human predilections are new. What's new is the media environment. What's new is the technology to allow all these things to happen. I don't think humans have changed all that much in terms of their ability to want to look for quick answers, to come up with schemes and all sorts of crazy explanations for things like we're seeing with the coronavirus pandemic. I can imagine that in every epidemic in history, there's been all sorts of fake news and disinformation, misinformation. It's now the ability to spread it is what's scary. But I do think people can kind of get over the curve. This is kind of new still. And these sort of crises, these things that we're facing right now are going to be huge lessons, and there'll be some damage, I suspect, as a result of those lessons too. But I think they're going to be big lessons. I mean, we won't get suckered for that again, and maybe another generation will have to learn that all over down the road someday. But the basic core idea of critical thinking and teaching it. Yeah, I don't mean just in college. That's way too late, if you ask me. You gotta talk about this in elementary school and middle school and high school at the very latest. It seems to me. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of digital natives think, wow, I can understand this environment pretty easily, and I can see just by looking at a website whether it's for real or whether it's not. And I think on the most superficial sort of examples they can, but the hard part, the thing that a lot of people don't understand, what it takes to evaluate evidence, what it takes to really see what other credible sources have to say about these kind of things, and to know who's behind the information. What do they have to gain? What are they trying to play? And I think that makes skeptics of all of us, and I think we kind of have to be. Journalists, the public, everybody. I don't think we're ever going to agree on things, but I think we'll get better at sort of understand and where the evidence falls flat. And there's plenty of examples of really ludicrous stuff going around right now that sort of has traction for a hot minute, but gets dismissed in the end. What did I see that if you pull a hair dryer in your face, you won't get coronavirus.
That's convenient. We'll just all do that.
Yeah, we're going to pause real quick so I can blow some hot air in my face.
Right. 5G. It's all 5G, man, and you got to microwave your mail.
Well, and I know people are on Facebook. They're seeing that, and when those posts get taken down, better read this before it gets taken down. This is a conspiracy. It's almost like there's this underlying current of like, this is the truth, and they don't want you to know. And it's like, well, do they not want you to know, or is it dangerous to spread that?
They literally are saying that.
Well, I think that's true, and I think that's one of the dangers, the inherent dangers of the fact-checking kind of movement, is that when you fact check something, the conspiracy theorists are going to think, see, they're just suppressing it, which just makes it look like we're being persecuted. Therefore, it's much more important than you really know. Well, I'm always suspicious of people who say they a lot.
Yeah,
those people.
I'm really suspicious of people who say the media as if it's one monolithic thing, and it's just not. And that's part of what we have to wrap our brains around too. There are all sorts of people out there who have media tools who are practicing media information for all sorts of good and bad reasons.
A lot of people, Sarah, a lot of people, same people that say, it's conspiracy that, they're taking this movement or whatever, also the same people that are like most easily yelling news when like the New York Times has to, go back on something that they reported the day before because they found new information that it was false, and they're like, oh, well, that was fake news, but like, that changed since yesterday. But if you change my news since yesterday, it's a conspiracy.
Right. And I think that's true. And you're certainly seeing that in the whole pandemic coverage. And I think it's because neither journalists nor politicians are very good, or the public, frankly, that we serve is very good at uncertainty. And that's what science has to deal with. We know things and we do not know things. And so our information is going to change. So how we communicate and the care in which we take to do that is really important. But when you get, politicians and even some journalists who have partisan games that they're trying to play, that you're just having all sorts of confusion out there. You don't have a authoritative source for a lot of information that you're going to see. And I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a great article in the New Yorker that came out in April. It was about the different experience between the coronavirus control methods going on in Seattle and in New York City. And Seattle followed a kind of a CDC epidemic intelligence playbook that was put together, back in the 2009 H1N1 virus thing that we hardly remember today, but it was fairly deadly, killed 12,000 people.
Yeah.
But Seattle was able to make some pretty good decisions early and communicate them really well and simply, and tell people that some of these things are probably going to change, but we're going to have to make some hard calls and get you on our side too. And I think by and large, people have sort of appreciated that when it's happened, and appreciated the health officials who are following that playbook, but that didn't happen in New York. It didn't happen for, a couple of weeks. And right now, a couple of weeks can make all the difference. We're talking about thousands of cases and hundreds of thousands of cases in some respects. So listening to people who are in authority, who know something about what they're talking about, has never been more important. And yet, there's part of us that wants to listen to the politicians in power. There's a generation that's my parents' generation that grew up with Walter Cronkite, and maybe even have memories of FDR talking to them in fireside chats, telling them they have nothing to fear but fear itself, and giving them this sort of soothing, we'll get through this together, a kind of talk. But there's also some difficult things that have to be said. You have to stay home. We can't go to school. We're gonna spread this thing and make it out of control because we don't have a virus. We don't have the protective gear. We have to be pretty honest about those things with people.
And not shoot the messenger.
Yeah, and that, otherwise who we got to listen to? So I do think that it's really important to let the health officials sort of take over here, and that's what happened during that H1N1 thing in 2009 that we don't even talk about or very much remember anymore. It was because people really did sort of follow the health authorities' kind of advice in these kind of cases. Now, this is magnified because of all the economic impacts. And there's some horrible decisions having to be made. And gosh, you got to be empathetic with the people who are suffering in those kind of circumstances. People are losing jobs. Whole generations may be, suffering in ways that they haven't because of the reaction here. But if you're not around, you can't even find a way out. So, that's why the health information, I think, needs to get a lot more emphasis. And we can't listen to what leaders talk about when they talk about cockamamie schemes to fix things, or different cures that haven't been tested, or the mixed messages that we're getting out of the White House right now are pretty crazy.
It's unfortunate when you get news sources that are right-leaning, left-leaning, and they kind of pick and choose what authorities to get the information from, because maybe you'll get some sources that really look at Andrew Cuomo, but then you'll get some sources that only look at Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, I think even Andrew Cuomo should have let his scientists take the lead.
Yeah,
and
crazy too
do the talking as well. It's so hard to tell people, it's okay. In the states, it's their responsibility to open and then send tweets out saying that liberate Michigan. And that's one of the hottest spots in the country right now. So, it's frustrating to watch these mixed messages, and that only decreases people's respect and for any kind of authoritative source right now. So it's a difficult time, and I think we're learning some hard lessons about media literacy and just about facts. But if I've got heart trouble, I'm not going to go to my garage and mechanic and ask him to fix it.
I would hope not.
Well, I know that for journalists right now, it's tough. I know a lot of news organizations are grappling with this idea of, when we had those White House press briefings every day, some organizations were like, we're not going to stream this live anymore because we don't want to be responsible for that messaging. But then there's that argument of, well, is it news? If a politician says it, is it news? And do we have to share that? Or do we not, because it could be irresponsible if it's not factual?
Well, it is a real debate, and you're right. You're exactly right, and it's a real debate because a lot of journalists come from a time when the president's words, no matter what he said, got scrutinized like you couldn't believe. stock market analysts were trying to read everything they could into those 5 words he gave at a press conference, or trying to figure out where this is going to go and what it could mean for business or security or taxes or whatever the case might be. But I also think there's a time in the past where politicians were a lot more measured in terms of what they said. They were careful about. They understood the response of markets and institutions to the things that they were going to see, and I don't think that's pretty much the goal right now. The goal seems to be to increase loyalty to a cause, and once you do that, then what really sort of matters. So I think this idea that you have to write down everything it says and watch him all the time. I mean, I would cover it. I'd have somebody there, but I don't think you have to choose what. You don't have to run it all live.
What's one of the pillars of journalism? It was report and do minimal harm or whatever it was.
Right. I mean, seek the truth and report it, and protect against collateral damage that comes from seeking the truth, and also what you can't verify, and be able to tell people what you know and can't verify versus what you can know. And I think right now, the people who are best at dealing with that kind of uncertainty are the people from the CDC, are the people from the NIH, are the people who are part of the epidemic, information system teams that know this stuff and understand it. And we get lost in sort of digressions and things that aren't really focused on the problem. I mean, I worry about China and the U.S. poking at each other. Here we are in a global crisis that's going to take some global cooperation to solve. And if they can't do that, I don't have much hope for a solution to global warming. I mean, there's another, sort of crisis that's going to cross borders. How do we talk to each other frankly and scientifically about those kind of things without overstating the case and without understanding what's really certain and what we don't know. So you have to be careful. If I can make any other point, that's it. It's boring. It requires kind of critical thinking. How do we know this? Who's behind it? What are other sources saying? But I do think that's what we're going to learn one way or the other out of this infodemic.
So right now we're in the age of quarantine, if you will, and I think it's arguable that like 100% of people are getting their news from social media. So what, I guess, advice per se, what would you say to those people how to responsibly consume their news through social media when there's just so much fast and quick stuff that they can see and kind of make their mind up about it however they want?
Right. I was looking at a study. I'm really interested in fact checking and media literacy approaches. How can you teach people how to check this kind of stuff for themselves? But one of the things that's so hard to do is get people to practice what I mentioned earlier, which is called click restraint. And I find that a lot of young people see social media kind of information, and I don't hope this doesn't sound unfair, but I mean they don't see it as news. As something that they have to use or that it's a part of their lives. It's mostly, is this entertaining? Is this something I want to know? Is this something that I sort of need to know in any sort of sense? Or is this just stuff that's flying at me a mile a minute? Because if it's that, then I really don't pay much attention, nor does it have much consequence if I just pass it along. Look at this is funny. Look how outrageous this is. So they're not really making a judgment on truth or stuff like that. It's mostly this kind of makes your stomach, makes you laugh or make you cry or something. It gets an emotional sort of engaging response from you. That's good. There was a study that came out of MIT just recently where they looked at how people looked at sort of online posts, and they realized people were sharing this stuff pretty regularly and never really asking themselves the question of whether it was true or not. Which was kind of startling. And they said, once they did this survey and this experiment again, and they just put that little nudge at the front of the Facebook post that says, "Is this true? Do you think this is true?" Mm-hmm. That people were suddenly a lot more careful.
Well, in the last episode, we referenced an article by Melissa Zimdar, and in 2016, she made a list of untrustworthy / misleading news sources. And she ended up writing an article, I think it was for the Washington Post. But in the article, she talks about how people base what they click on off of emotion. It's not based on, oh, like this could be good information. It's, oh, this is how this made me feel, therefore I'm going to view it.
Yeah, and what are the lines between entertainment and infotainment and news? What are the lines between commentary and factual reporting? All those things have been blurred to a certain extent. So the media has, I know I said it's not monolithic, but it does have some chickens that are coming home to roost here. And there is a part of it that has to try to, at least under its advertising model, which is suspect as ever these days, that got to get a lot of clicks, got to get people to hit it. Well, what do people click on? They click on things that make them angry. They click on things that make them laugh. We know that.
I got myself in trouble the other day. I shared a link on Facebook, and it was a picture of Dr. Fauci that was photoshopped to look ominous and dark, and then there was another person pictured right next to him. And it said, this is what the government's not telling you. And when you click the link, it takes you to a YouTube video that is just Rick Astley singing. And I shared it, getting Rick rolled. And I shared it because I was like, oh, this is funny, because I see so many people sharing these, oh, this is what the government, doesn't want you, and blah, 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 and how Hollywood's run by elite pedophiles, and this is what Brad Pitt has to say. That's a real story that someone shared. But I realized
one thing I would
people were clicking on this link I shared, and they were clicking on it they were reacting to it without actually clicking on it, because they're reacting, why would you share this? I'm like, well, if you actually click on it, it's a music video. So I had to edit my post and say, this is not real. This is just a joke. Click on it and you'll understand. And I'm just like, wow, that was like one that hit me really hard, is that people really don't look into things.
No, my favorite comments on the Facebook comments are there's always someone that's like, did you actually read the article? And they're like, well, I read the headline and
Or they'll share an article from 2011.
No, there's a lot of times, somebody will comment and they won't even realize that, this or their argument. It just sounds like it's not in the headline.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's absolutely true. It just makes the point, that it's coming at us so fast and furious. It's like drinking out of a fire hose, and so what do? You just react quickly. You sift it. You knock it this way. You knock it that way. You get rid of it. But I wish people would hit the delete button much more than the click on it button. I mean, that's. I don't know how to make people do that, but your experience with your the post that you made about the music video strikes me as exactly what journalists are feeling as they're filing stories.
Yeah.
How do I do this to make anybody sort of read this and think about this in a different way? Maybe I should be doing memes instead of stories. Maybe I should be doing what? How do I show that news is important in a social media environment? That's not a bad question. That's a tough question to answer, but how do you include complexity in something as simple as a meme? It's got to be awfully smart, if you're going to be able to get something that works on all those levels. Yeah.
Dennis, what do you think about fact-checking websites like Snopes, things like that, like the use of social media like Twitter and Facebook to try to differentiate the facts from the fiction?
I'm glad they exist, and I wish there were more of them. In fact, one of my favorite organizations is the International Network of Fact Checkers, and you can go online and if you want to fact check just the coronavirus stuff, there's been about 5,000 fact checks on stuff on that alone.
It's got to be exhausting.
And it is exhausting, and it's exhausting to be the editor of Snopes right now. It's exhausting to be any of these fact-checking people, because they can't possibly fact-check all of it. I mean, if they could really fact-check the internet, then you could sue these guys for libel. But one of the reasons why social media, is sort of immune from libel suits is because nobody can fact-check all this stuff. Mm-hmm. Nobody can really sort of knows what can happen out there. So I'm glad it exists, but you can't fact check everything. And one of the problems is if you put a little mark on something that said this is true, but you didn't get to everything, does that mean all the stuff that you didn't put the mark on is wrong? Well, no. There's going to be a certain amount of bad information out there always. And you know what? In my life, my parents' life, my grandfather's life, there were those kinds of there was misinformation and disinformation out there all the time. The difference is its spreadability. The difference is the way it can kind of go exponentially. But here's one more thing I would add to your thinking about this, if you are, is that there are a lot of people out there that aren't participating in this all the time the way a lot of us are. You know, I think there's a lot of people that are paying attention and that don't talk a lot about it much, that aren't fully engaged in social media. They may watch Facebook with their friends and their family, but it's not something they sort of live on in a way. And there are people that have actually tried that, to live on social media full time for a while, as journalists kind of have to do, and found it entirely exhausting. You know, so you know, I think taking a break, having a news diet is what I call it, you know, that makes sense. Where do you get your information? I have a friend of mine that calls it newstrition. And
that's pretty good.
And she's a farmer, and she also goes to farmers markets. And she always tells people the things that sell out first are the real necessities, like carrots. You know, I mean, the things that people really want and use because they're going to run out of them if they don't have them. The expensive, fancy items really sort of are there, and she hopes they sell out. But it's the essential kinds of things. So, you know, eat your vegetables is what she's saying. And part of that comes from having sort of sources that you can go to over and over again to look at their information, who actually hire people to vet their information, who actually look at what they've said in the past and try to see if they're consistent, who try to explain changes in what they know. And here's the other thing. I talk about this in libraries and stuff all over the state. I call it what happened to the news. It's for an older generation primarily. And believe me, they're flabbergasted as they look and they try to see what's going on. But they say, who do I trust? And I think it's a question we all ask. But one of the things I've been saying lately is trust the person who tells you when they get it wrong.
Right, no kidding.
You know, and think about who does that and who doesn't do that. You know, I think everybody makes mistakes. Journalists make mistakes. They have to when you're dealing with all that information. It's a part of it. Now, do they do it every single story? Do they do it all the time? Do they correct their mistakes? Do they do it prominently? When I see somebody apologize, it doesn't bother a journalist apologize for making a mistake. It doesn't bother me. No. It gives them some credibility. And it gives them some credibility that might make me want to listen to them another time. Now, if they continue to do this, I'm going to have to find somebody else.
Right.
But I actually have go-to places. I have a news cycle, a news diet, and yours is going to be different from mine. But I found them to be mostly credible in a lot of different things. I also try to mix it up so that I don't get this echo chamber effect that you've talked about already, which I think is very real and hard to get out of.
It's very hard, yeah.
But I will look at stories. I'll look at critical kind of things and see, you know, what's tenable, what's rooted sort of factually, what's making, because I think you have to, because, you know, all of us really needs good information when it's counterintuitive. You know, there's something that's true that we don't want to believe, but it's true.
Yeah.
And we should know.
Yes.
So, you know, that's when we had institutions that were big and robust and had gone through enough battles that you knew you could trust them, even when they said counterintuitive things. That's harder to do in this environment too, because there's always another source that can combat that thing. So I still think it's important to have journalists. I still think local journalism matters, and that's my biggest fear right now. Yeah. That given the current environment, that there may not be many of those who are out there are stressed, barely hanging on. There's a lot more talk in my ethics and trend seminar about alternatives and nonprofit journalism right now, and lots of different ways that they might be able to keep doing it because they know it matters. They know that the economic model may be exploded, but they do know that there's a demand for good information out there. They feel it themselves. They want to be providers of that, and I think that's laudable. So I think local news has to be supported somehow. And how are we going to change the models, and how are we going to even have this conversation on a bigger sort of scale? But I think there's one of the things that I see out there that I really like is collaboration among news sources.
Yeah.
That may sound strange, but I don't think anybody can get to everything on a local level anymore. They really do have to kind of combine and find things that each one is good at and put it together in a project or something like that adds depth and perspective to some kind of issue. Now, getting people to read it's going to be another thing. Mm-hmm. But I do think over time people are going to have to gravitate to stuff that saves them.
It's kind of what we're trying to do with this show too. There's so many. And, podcasts are still a relatively new form of media. There was a stat we talked about where only 50% of Americans have listened to a podcast. And there's so many where it's just talking heads. It's, this is my opinion. This is my opinion. Boom, we're done. And what we're trying to do with this show is create something that by the end of it, we can actually be constructive and learn something and actually add. And, we have all three of us with different perspectives. And, we're actually putting in the research, putting in the time with the sources, putting, in the time with different perspectives and trying to learn and bring a new idea to it, and then bringing in, experts like yourself to add to the conversation in a constructive way rather than just like, here's some more noise.
Yeah. Well, power to you. That's all I can say. I've been listening to a lot of podcasts lately. I take my 2-mile walk every day.
Oh, there you go.
And when I do, I've got the podcasts on, and I love the ones that have lots of segments and bring in lots of voices.
Yep.
And voices are different kind of experts, and even voices on credible voices on different sides of controversies. I love hearing that. I really have a mind. I can make up my mind
right.
and decide things. I can think critically.
That's like my wife. We talk about it a lot. Where she's very quick to cut somebody out of social media if they're spewing ideas or topics that don't align with her, and she wonders why I have so many people on my social media that are on every side of the spectrum. And I say, I don't want to close myself off to that. I don't want to create my own echo chamber. So that's why I have, my conservative friends that I grew up with in Bonner, Montana. And then, my liberal friends that I went to the university with and, who say or whatever. But I don't want to close myself off to stuff that I can learn or, different perspectives I can gain, because it just doesn't help you at all.
Right. And even empathy for other points of view. I mean,
right.
Empathy for other people who believe things. That's kind of foundational. We have to have it if we're going to understand each other. And it's hard sometimes. It's much easier to make a cutting joke and cut them off, But I think you have to know what other people are saying. You have to understand where it goes. You also have to know how to put it in sort of spatial perspective. How much weight is there about this particular issue? And with social media today, we can track how many clicks. We can track the viralness of something. So even if it gets a short, hot spike, we're able to sort of think in our minds that, whoa, this is much bigger than we think. I think it's always been big in some ways. We just couldn't measure it before. But how did people really act? I've seen a lot of polls in Montana. And that's what I can talk about the best. But people are sort of, buying a lot of the advice that they're getting on how to act in the coronavirus situation. And people are being careful about it. And people who are listening to good information are staying home, are taking care of each other, are doing those things, even before the government says they have to. And it's easy to put some of the other sort of reactions to it in a much bigger context. I was even thinking about the protests at capitals across the country about opening up quickly. And I understand the pressure to open up quickly. Gosh, there's real pain here. But the question is, how do we do that in a way that safeguards people's lives? And I see those groups, and then more reporting about who's behind them, and they're fairly small. They're not all that representation.
Well, and then you get the people, what was it, down at the beach in Florida, where they're like, I've been in quarantine, I need to get drunk, I need to party. And it's like, what do you do about people like that?
Well, I think, I don't know what you can do with people like that don't want to pay much attention to it, other than they will learn or they won't.
Yeah.
And the consequences of not learning could be kind of deadly sometimes.
Also, what do you think the press could do to bring in some of the skeptics of news again? You mentioned that people, that have always been somewhat skeptical of the news, going back to even the 70s and further back. But it seems like that's gone down since then. How do we bring back, say, a Trump supporter or something that, that just does not believe anything that the New York Times says just because it's the New York Times until, Donald Trump tweets it or something? Like, how do you bring back those people into the fray?
Well, I don't know. All I can do is keep putting out or encourage people to put out information that stands up over time. It's easy to think of the situations that we live in the moment as lasting forever, but they don't. And people change, and situations change, and different things emerge as sort of social truths that people can understand, and sometimes it takes hard lessons to kind of make that happen. I don't know. I mean, I think there's also some problems with journalists on the left who look down upon people on the right.
Yes.
I think there is a kind of a bias sometimes against a blue-collar sort of work ethic in America. And boy, what a shame. I mean, what part of American society has suffered as much? Nicholas Kristof was at the university here this semester, right before we got locked down. And he wrote a book about what's happened to the middle class based on what happened to his hometown of Yamhill, Oregon, a little kind of manufacturing town not that far from Portland. But so many people there are just locked in sort of cycles of depression and despair and drugs and alcohol because they really don't have the dignity of work and manufacturing and sort of reason to sort of exist. And this is before any sort of pandemic. And I think we haven't paid nearly enough attention to that, really. And, it's more than just being angry. It's coming up with systems and solutions that work for a lot of people, because those folks are making, wages that really haven't gained in any sort of real inflationary means since the 1970s. And sort of how do you talk about an equitable system? How do you talk about making it work for a lot more people? And I think those issues don't get discussed very much. We get distracted away from them. We get distracted by the anger and by the partisanship, but we have to have a lot more meetings of the minds over solutions instead of distractions. And that's easy for me to say. It's hard for me to make that happen, but I don't know any other way than to encourage people of goodwill to get outside their bubbles. And I think, the area where you're more likely to do that is at the local level. I think we're much more likely as people to meet each other on the softball diamond or, at a nonprofit that's fixing up the parks or in some food drive to help somebody whose house burned down.
It's very easy for a Texan to get mad at a Californian.
Right, and it's much easier to get mad at people online than in person.
Well, and I'm glad you said that, Dennis, because I do think that there's a huge problem with, in the left media, we do have that kind of ivory, watchtower kind of issue where we look down on everyone. And in 2016, I was kind of covering the campaign trail, and a lot of what I heard is that, well, I'm too scared to talk about this because we've made it mainstream to shut down certain conversations. And we still need to present facts, but we need to be careful not to completely stop dialogue and make it a little bit, popular to disenfranchise these people, because then they don't speak up, or they go on these very niche platforms, or they're yelling on Facebook, and then all of a sudden we get election results, or we get, something that blows our mind, and we're so shocked that there's this section of people who believe this, and it's because we didn't talk to them. We didn't ask. We didn't open up the dialogue, and I think that's really important.
Well, and I know a lot of people that I grew up with, they're afraid, I think they've become more confident since he was elected, but I know some people that were afraid to say that they were Trump supporters because, they get looked down upon.
Yeah. And we really have no one to blame but ourselves when that conversation shuts off, or when we lose that opportunity to educate each other, because we can't allow certain types of hate and vitriol, but we really have to make sure that we're not completely shutting off a discourse, because I don't want to live in a world where it's one-sided all the time.
The average American doesn't go to a university for journalism, so I think there's a lot of misunderstanding from the average person of what a journalist is, what are the things that they live up to be good at what they do. And so, a lot of times when I hear somebody criticizing a journalist, like I always sort of like shake my head and I wish that they knew how much of oneself goes into being a journalist and how risky it is, even in the modern age, even in America, how risky it is sometimes for these people to report the stories that they do.
Yeah, and some of the attacks that I've seen on journalists lately, and some of these are my students who are talking to me about being in Phoenix and photographing scenes and being verbally abused and coming within an inch of being beat up. And I just think, all he's doing is covering something. In his case, he was covering a protest. He was giving them a voice, a platform, and yet he was somehow the messenger of of what's wrong, and he was catching the scorn for it. And I just thought, gosh, that's pretty sad. And I also think you mentioned another point about it, just this engaging with your audience, knowing your audience, and I think that's one of the things that journalists forget so quickly. We think of the people we cover as kind of two-dimensional, without, they're just not real. They're characters, they're props. They listen to what we give them, and boy, that doesn't work really well. And some of the good collaborative things that I've seen lately are ones that engage communities in what's important. And I've seen newspapers, I've seen radio stations do this. I've seen TV stations put this on. There's something called the Solutions Journalism Network that's doing some good work in these areas too. But what they do is they get news people to sort of have meetings and buy beer, and get people to talk about, what stories they'd like to see. They can all agree on that they'd like to see the media kind of pursue. Now, I'm not going to surrender as a journalist my, prerogative to point out problems that people need to pay attention to that they don't see.
Right.
But I also think we do have to make sure that we're relevant. We have to make sure that we're covering things that people really care about and understand, and we understand their lives. And that's kind of a problem for journalism. I mean, journalism does have some things to answer for about its past, about its practices. Mm-hmm. And, it's hard for us to explain it because there's no one way to be a journalist. There's no law. There's no test. There's no school, that everybody has to go to do this. So, that's one of the things that we have to make sure people understand immediately, too. Who is the media? What I always ask people when they criticize the media, I say, well, who are you talking about?
Yeah. It's a fair question.
Who exactly are you talking about? Tell me, because it's not monolithic. And there are journalists that follow what I think are ethical, critical thinking, best practices, and there are journalists I don't like to get in this argument of who's a journalist or what. I think it's kind of self-defeating because anybody with access to a platform can adopt that, can commit an act of journalism, as I like to say, So you have to be careful. Who does it repeatedly well? Who does it with credibility over the time? Who is willing to admit their mistakes? And those are not bad guidelines. And I think when people hear you talk about those kind of things, they listen for that too. But I also think you have to listen to them.
All right, guys, we're coming up on time here. Dennis, before we head out, any final point you would like to make?
Well, no, I just, I've been on a media literacy kick lately, and I'm
don't say.
going to be doing some speeches and some presentations around the place, but I really think it needs to be something that the school systems do. And I think only less than half of the states in the U.S. have sort of media literacy state-mandated curriculums throughout the states. I know Montana doesn't. And it has a very sort of loose policy, so you're going to teach it. Or rather, high school librarians can teach it if they want to.
Yeah, I know. That's the thing. We didn't really learn at Hellgate.
They're petrified of this stuff. They're going to be between parents and principals and
it's a touchy thing.
All sorts of angry thing. I do these sort of things at high school teachers conferences, and I had trouble getting people even to come to something about teaching people to spot fake news because they didn't want to do that in their math classes or their science classes or their social studies classes or their history classes, because it's going to put them at odds with parents who think you're just touting some sort of line. But really, it's just critical thinking, and it matters to every topic you can possibly think of.
Critical thinking. It's more important than you think. Dennis, thank you for coming on. It was
Thanks,
great
Dennis.
to have you. Great talking to you. I hope you're doing
thank
well.
You so much.
Hope you can make it out on the river this summer. It'd be nice to go fly fishing once in a while.
I'm trying to plan a trip. We'll see if it happens.
Do what you can. All right, Dennis, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to talk to you guys.
Yep, have a good one.
You too.
Bye-bye.
All right, guys. So that was Dennis Swibold, and I didn't state it before, but he was my journalism ethics professor. I took the same class that he was mentioning, and it is a wonderful class. I know a lot of people think at the end of their collegiate career, their ethics course is the most strenuous and the most boring that they can take, but that journalism ethics course, and if Dennis got you thinking now, he got us really thinking during that course, and it's a fascinating thing to listen to. It really is.
You could tell. I mean, the guy is fascinating to listen to.
He's been in the industry a while, and he knows what he's talking about, and so he's a perfect example of the people that we want to bring onto this show to voice their experiences and voice their perspectives, because they know what they're talking about, quite frankly, and so it's really helpful to have someone like Dennis on. But we're going pretty far, but I want to go around. Curtis, what are your thoughts? What's going through your mind right now? What piqued your interest from our conversation with Dennis?
Well, I mean,
That was a deep sigh.
It was yeah. Well, I kind of just trying to take it all in. He said a lot of what we were already talking about, but just much better.
Yeah, that's very accurate.
I love what he said about what news organizations or what, I don't know, just what are you listening to that never admits that they're wrong. We talked about last week that there were these fake news awards and that Trump was putting out that was on the official GOP website. And I thought it was a really bad representation of the Republican Party because there's nothing wrong with the news getting something wrong if they correct it. What's wrong about it is if the newspaper does it on purpose and then doesn't correct it.
Right.
Doesn't have that fall back on their integrity. And so when he said make sure that whatever you're ingesting admits when they're wrong and how important that is, that really rung true for me, because that's one of my main criticisms of a lot of websites for the news. It's one of my main criticisms of Trump. You never hear him say he's wrong. Everybody's wrong. Everybody is wrong at some point, and so I would distrust, even in real life, people who seem to be infallible. Because they usually are as much or more fallible than everyone else.
I mean, just us, right? We're perfect.
Oh, yeah,
but that's
absolutely.
beside the
Yeah.
point.
Listen to us, people. No, we're joking. Kara, what are your thoughts? What are your final remarks?
Yeah, I think, he hit on it great. We've never had such a saturated news market, if you will. We've never been able to pull from as many sources as we can today. And so I think we have to remember to check our own biases and the people that are screaming the loudest, whether they be a politician or whether it be your neighbor on her blog. It doesn't mean that they're right. And I think as consumers, it's really important for us to make sure as we're reading news, it's okay if it's uncomfortable because it challenges something we want to believe. That doesn't mean it's wrong. And so we need to make sure that we're kind of checking that in ourselves. And then as journalists, like he said, are we thinking of our audience, or are we thinking about our agenda? And I think there's definitely blame on both sides. And I think that a good place to start is as a consumer to make sure that you're responsibly consuming your media and giving it a little bit of thought.
All right, y'all. I think that'll do it for news literacy, part 1 and 2. We're not sure what we're going to be covering in the next episode, but we'll figure that out eventually. Thanks for listening. You can check us out on podcastswithoutborders.com. You can shoot us an email at pwbnetwork@gmail.com if you want to get a hold of us about anything. If you have any topics that you want us to cover, let us know. We'd love to talk about it. Do you guys want to plug anything? Do you have anything to plug?
No, Harry Styles has a new music video out. Everyone go check it out.
Oh, from
Watermelon
Sugar. Yeah. Did you hear about what happened on set during that? That
everyone he's the consent
king. Asking for consent to touch her hair and her to kiss him. Oh, he's a wonderful person. Also, he has that song where he's in the music video. He's just singing to a fish.
Oh gosh, I should know this. I made my boyfriend watch the whole 8 minutes when it came out.
They're really fun music videos. It's a good time. I'm fine with him.
I do have something.
Curtis, what do you have to plug?
Okay, so about 2 months ago, I did a film for a stay-at-home film competition. You have to make it in 48 hours. You can't leave your house. And I finally uploaded it to YouTube on my channel. So if you look up on YouTube, it's called Call Somebody, and you can check out a 5-minute movie where I try to bring back my dramatic acting chops, and it all has to do with dealing with a death due to the coronavirus, and I play a character that starts out as a skeptic that everything's news, and by the end of it, my hope is that it expresses that my character's changed his mind, and that when he becomes personally affected by it. On YouTube, it's called Call Somebody.
There we go. Very fitting. All right, folks, and don't forget to rate and review wherever Apple Podcasts, wherever Spotify you find your podcasts. But yeah, I think that'll do it. So listen in for the next episode. Thanks, y'all. Thank you for listening to Social Discord, part of the Podcasts Without Borders Network. You can get a hold of us by sending us an email at pwbnetwork@gmail.com. You can also check out our website at podcastwithoutborders.com. You can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/PWBN. Thanks for listening.